Welcome back, and today we're going to talk about the 1920s and the 1930s. And we're going to take both those decades together, and we are going to talk about them today and tomorrow. So what we're going to talk about today is the overall design trends from those two decades, the social influences that contributed to the design trends. Some of the changes were very, very big. Some were very, very small. We're going to talk about that. So stay tuned. We will be right back. All right, so what are all these design changes? Well, let's start with the big one, the one we all take completely for granted, and that's electricity. In 1920, about a third of the American homes were electrified, and that was huge. By 1930, it was over 2/3. So the decade of the 1920s was the big leap in electrification of America. Massive change. For those of us who have had electricity all our lives, it's hard to even imagine the scope of that change. And where we see that impacting home design is primarily in the kitchen. Electricity gave us a refrigeration, for one thing. I don't know about you, I find it very hard to imagine life without opening that box and getting something cold to drink. But that was life before the 1920s. And in fact, in 1920, that was life for 2/3 of America. So this was just massive. In the 1930s, of course, 2/3 of America was electrified, and that number would just continue to rise, so that by 1940, unless you were out on a remote farmstead, you had electricity. And so we have these 2 decades of, electrification and the appliances and labor-saving devices that came along with it. I mentioned refrigeration, lighting. Lighting was huge. In new home construction, the wiring was being built in. In older homes, wiring was being added. And we would see what we now call raceway wiring, where the wiring is applied along the surface of the wall. It would be along the baseboard, crawling up by the door jamb and coming out to a little switch. That is still, to this day, that's one of the reasons that our light switches are right next to a doorway, even if they don't need to be. Yes, of course, it's nice to have the light you can turn on when you walk into the room, but it doesn't necessarily have to be right there. It is because that was how it was originally, because that wire ran up along the door molding. So you just walk in, there it was, a box on the wall, and you flipped it. And you still see that, by the way, in homes that have industrial design, that surface-mounted raceway wiring. And frankly, I find it very interesting when I see that in modern industrial designed homes. So huge. You had light when you wanted it. And that changed so much for us because you could stay up late. Your house was light. Prior to electricity, people pretty much went to bed with the sun. It was not just difficult. I don't know if you've ever dealt with lanterns or candlelight. Things like reading or doing any fine work are extremely difficult. And since there was obviously no television, no radio, etc., there wasn't a lot to do in terms of personal entertainment. Once the sun went down, people went to bed. People kept cow hours. Sun goes down, cow goes to sleep. Well, so did the people. So that was just a huge, huge lifestyle change. And in terms of decoration, obviously, the massive change was lighting. So let's start off by taking a look at some of the lighting from the 20s and 30s. I'm just going to give you a small sampling because, obviously, we're going to get into lamps. And lamps are always sort of a common theme with us. But just going to take a quick look. Now, I've done something new because some of you have said the pictures don't stay up long enough. So I'm going to leave each one of these images up for 6 seconds instead of 3, which is what I've been doing in the past. Let me know if you like it or if this is something that's annoying for you. I want to hear your feedback on the duration of the images on the screen. Okay, lighting of the 20s and 30s. Okay, and we've seen some of this before, and we will continue to take a look at it. That was our huge change. We had lights coming down from the ceiling. We had lights on tables. We had floor lamps. The lamp over here behind me is from the 1930s. And that was, in fact, that is a wonderful piece of art moderne lighting. I know you're thinking Art Deco. We're going to get into that tomorrow, though. That one's moderne. That was a major change. But kitchens, again, huge, huge change because of that refrigerator taking over for the icebox. So let's take a look at some pictures of interior decor, and we're going to start with the 1930s because we've been going backwards. So let's take a look at the 1930s. All right. Those, by the way, those images were only like 3 seconds because there were so many of them. But again, I want your feedback. Let me know which one you prefer. The pictures from the 1930s were not all that different from the pictures from the 1940s. Again, we had a parlor and not really a living room. People were not living in that parlor. That was a company room. And one of our viewers had said that she had a neighbor who kept a parlor that was literally roped off with one of those velvet ropes like you see in movie theaters. And yep, rope came down when guests came in, guests left, room got scrubbed down, rope went back up again and stayed like that. It reminds me of my grandmother's house. It was still the parlor. The heart of the home at this point was still the kitchen as it had been in generations past. And the changes in terms of the styles of furniture, again, not big changes. We are seeing a lot of chairs. We are seeing more comfortable furniture in the 1930s than we had seen previously in 1910 and 1900 in 1880. Furniture was more comfortable, more stuffed chairs, more fully upholstered pieces. Pieces where when you looked at it, you saw fabric and not wood. That was very much the same as the 40s. Again, no coffee tables, doilies and antimacassars to try to preserve the furnishings. And remember, the 1930s was the decade of the Great Depression. There was not a lot of money floating around in this country. And when people did have a little bit of money to sort of cobble together, furniture in the home, as long as you had enough places to sit, it wasn't considered a priority. There wasn't that sort of keeping up with the Joneses and maintaining an elegant parlor, as would happen in more modern times. So, want to take a look at the 20s? The 20s is getting difficult, and here's why. In the 1930s, photography was much more accessible. When you get into the 1920s and decades earlier, photographs of real homes, the places that people were living in, are scarce. Even magazine photographs are difficult to come by. And what I want to show you is real homes, not designers' ideas of what your home ought to look like. So the pictures from the 1920s are mostly magazine ads, not decorator pages, because magazine ads don't necessarily show how people live, but it's a closer representation than something you would find in decorator magazines, although they didn't actually have like tons of decorator magazines out at the time. They did have resources. Certainly they did have magazines, they did have pictures, but our best images are coming from ads, newspaper and magazine ads, and they are trying to sell things like flooring and appliances. And one of them, and please note, the first one is a radio ad. So, 1920s, let's take a look. So, you see, we're starting to get into a resource crunch. And from here on, I'm probably going to have to mostly show you pictures of individual articles of furniture rather than pictures of how they were laid out in homes and how they were actually used. Because, again, photography was a luxury. And it the problem I have with that, of course, is it doesn't show us how average people lived. And especially it doesn't show us how lower income people lived. And that was something that I tried very hard to include in our pictures of the 40s, how lower income families were living. And I'm sure you'll remember that from, the ironing board out and the wash drying in front of the fireplace. These were not grand, elegant homes. The grand, elegant homes are always going to be grand and elegant. They're also always going to be the way some people think other people ought to live. They're not going to be the way real people lived. Real people used their homes, the way real people covered their windows or, parked their butts when they were listening to the radio or doing their sewing or whatever. And so we're going to have to work a little harder to get that. So 20s, those images are mostly from ads. So consequently, they're very sort of kitchen intensive. And kitchens. I saw a great many kitchen ads, especially ads for stoves. And I'm not using any of them. And the reason that I'm not is because none of their stoves are as nice as mine. And that's just the way it is. My stove has some beautiful Art Deco graphics on it. It's one of the reasons that's my stove, and I didn't get another stove. But I waited a long time. I had a 4-foot gap in my kitchen and a hot plate on my counter for 8 years, waiting for that stove to fall into my lap, and it did. So here is my stove. His name is Ezra, by the way. Here we go. Those last two pictures, by the way, the first picture was the first page of an ad from a 1933 Sears catalog, and my stove is a Sears, and it shows a plain version of my stove. As you can see, it costs like $36 back in 1933. And the other picture was the other side of that ad so that you could see some other stoves. Now, that's what most of them looked like. They're beautiful. They really are. They just don't have the deco flair that mine does, which is why we took a close-up look at mine. And I wanted you to see a few things about my stove. That sort of wood stove burner, the disc burner in the middle with the little disc burner lifter. That's a transitional piece. That's moving from the wood stove era into the modern stove era. So there's a combination of those open lacework burner grates and the old-fashioned disc burner. Mine is a kerosene stove, by the way, and at some point in the future, we are going to go take a look at that from the point of view more of technology than design. Today we're looking at it in terms of design. In the future, we're going to take a hardcore look at the technology because that was a kerosene stove and it's propane now, but that's something we're going to take a look at later. The stoves, the refrigerators, the sinks, the things that you saw, that's what people were spending their money on if they had it. You could sit anywhere, but the stove cooked your dinner. The sink washed your dishes. The refrigerator kept your milk cold. So people prioritized, as they would today. I don't know about you, but if it were up to me, if I had to choose between a new sofa and a stove, it would be the stove any day because it's a more practical choice. Now, there were some pieces of furniture that came in during this period. And that's the telephone table. With electricity came the telephone. Now, the figures I have on telephone use in America at this time are suspect. And I have to say that. They are from Bell Telephone. And according to Bell Telephone in 1920, 35% of American households had telephone. I don't think so. That was the same number as had electricity, remember? Well, by 1928, what was my figure in 1928? By 1928, 68% of American homes had electricity. So remember, 35% in 1920, that doubled by the end of the decade. However, you didn't hit 2/3 of American households having telephones until the middle of the 1950s. So that was the first thing that made me suspicious of this figure of 35%. The second thing is Bell Telephone had a monopoly. They had a government-protected monopoly to provide phone service to America without competition. However, there was a string attached. The government said, we will protect your right to be free of competition, but you must bring phone service to the entire country. So Bell had a vested interest in keeping their numbers high. I believe where they came up with this 35% number was they took the overall population, they divided it by the number of people in each household, and then divided that figure by the number of telephones. Now, you see the flaw in that already, I'm sure. Telephones did not go into homes first. They went into municipal services like fire and police, where you would expect them. They went into hospitals. They went into government offices, city hall. They went into businesses. That's where they went. So I believe that 35% of America having phones included the police department, the fire department, your local shoe store, the city hall, the hospital. And I think that's how those numbers got inflated. Because anecdotally, the evidence does not support 1/3 of Americans having phones in the 1920s. In the 1920s, a phone was still a luxury item. However, it was beginning to have an impact. And I want you to take a look at something. I wanted to show you some telephone tables. And I included different designs. This is just generic telephone table, not necessarily from the 1920s or the 1930s. And you'll see why when you see the pictures. So here you go, telephone tables. Okay, now you saw that fabulous 1950s sort of space age atomic telephone table. I needed to include that. I felt I had to. That was just, So the telephone table was a new piece of furniture that came along to house the telephone. It was a place to either sit while you talked, some of them included chairs, or a place to keep a phone book or a drawer for a pencil and a piece of paper, and then a flat surface for your phone. The phone was in the hall. When phones came into homes, that's where they were originally located, the front hall or the front foyer. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, but not every home has it. Well, every home that had a telephone did, because telephones went into the wealthiest of homes first, and they certainly had grand entryways. That's where they kept the telephone. Now, I don't know this for a fact, but I would say my theory on why the phone was in the front hall was because that's where your guests came in physically. So that's where your guests came in metaphorically when you have the phone. It was sort of a reception area, hence phone. The phone was, in fact, a new piece of furniture in the house. It may have been small, but like lamps that demanded tables, so that in the 1950s, we saw an abundance of end tables next to sofas and chairs so that you could put a lamp on them. We saw telephone tables in the 1920s and 30s so that you could put your phone on it. By the 1950s, the phone was on the wall in the kitchen. It was on any end table or just any surface you could find. I knew one family when I was a kid, and they kept their phone on the coffee table in the living room, which I always thought was odd because we didn't do it at my house, and so it just seemed strange to me. But yep, that's where their phone lived, on the coffee table in the living room. So the phone brought its own little bits of furniture with it. It was a stylistic change. So now I'm sure you're saying to yourself, but wait, Sue, what about Art Deco? Well, that's what we're going to get into tomorrow. Now, we've talked about the differences between Art Deco and Art Nouveau, and those differences are very distinct. Tomorrow, we're going to get into something that's a little more nuanced, and it's Art Deco and Art Moderne. Art Deco came out of the Paris Exposition, 1925. Remember that it was the summer of 25. Paris Exposition. If Art Deco has an anniversary, we know what it is. Then in the 1930s, in America, we came up with Art Moderne. And Art Deco and Art Moderne are very, very closely related. There's a lot of overlap, but one is European, one is American, and I want to get into this and show you the difference. It's something I really, really love. It is a gorgeous style. If I could bear to get away from Eastlake, and you see the bookcase behind me, that's Eastlake. I don't know if I can part with that. If I could move away from Eastlake at all, it would absolutely be to Art Deco, Art Moderne. Fabulous, fabulous design. But it's not something I want to incorporate into, another video. It deserves a video of its own. So tomorrow, Art Deco, Art Moderne. Today, 20s and 30s. Other than the Art Deco and Art Moderne, not a lot was new. Electricity, yes. Telephone, yes, definitely. So, looks like we really are getting out of here in less than 30 minutes today. I've been trying to do it. I haven't been able to. I think today we're going to make it. Okay, so before we wind up, a little bit of business. If you want to contact me, discuss anything, comment on the videos. If you get in touch with me through my Etsy shop, I may or may not be able to respond. Usually I reserve that in case I need to get in touch with you for giveaways or things like that. Otherwise, I'm much more comfortable with going through the videos. If you have questions, especially identification questions, I want to share that with the group. I don't want to take that off the board because this is about sharing with all of you. So play nice with me. Share with everybody. If you have something interesting that you want to say, let's share it with the whole class. All right. Have a fantastic day. I really want to see you guys tomorrow because this is the video I have been looking forward to for 2 weeks. All right. See you then.